London. Dark morning sky, cold wind penetrating the thick walls of Buckingham Palace. Ordinary tourists are preparing for a significant moment, the changing of the guard. All but one man. Jonathan J. Harrison, a well-known MMA fighter in sports circles, came to London from New York to demonstrate his skills. At the age of 30, he became one of the greatest champions in the world, winning titles in the most prestigious tournaments. But this time, his training did not prepare him for the reality he would face in the palace. Explosive, irrepressible, he approached the static figure of one of the guards, dressed in a red tunic and wearing the famous hat. "This is what I call security," he laughed, praising the perfectly preserved discipline of the British Army. The tourists, filming with their phones, did not know that they were watching the beginning of a test that would change everything. Jonathan J. Harrison has always believed that his success in martial arts is the result of continuous work, self-respect, and his invincible spirit. As a world champion in MMA, he has long been accustomed to the public's attention. His Instagram was full of triumphant photos with medals and trophies. He was always greeted with applause in the gym, and his name became a symbol of strength and endurance. But this time he felt something different when he stepped onto the hard ground of London. He was in the capital to continue his sporting endeavors and also to see Buckingham Palace, for which he had long since learned the tradition of the changing of the guard. But something was wrong today. Jay could not contain his confidence. Here, among the usual tourists and imposing guardsmen, it seemed to him that it was all just an act. "This isn't combat," he thought, looking at one of the figures standing motionless with a kind of disdainful sneer. The guardsman he had been watching closely stood motionless in his red uniform and huge hat. Not a shadow of emotion on his face, not a hint of fatigue or nervousness. Jay felt a certain contempt for the idea of being so static, like a puppet. "Let's see if this warrior can withstand a real challenge," Jay thought, and felt a spark of excitement flare up inside him. He raised his eyebrows as he surveyed the audience that had gathered to witness the changing of the guard ritual. Everyone was mesmerized, but he couldn't look at it seriously. He approached the guard while his team, a few of his comrades in arms who were nearby, watched intently. "We'll show them what real combat is," he muttered to his friends as he confidently approached the static guard. One of his comrades grinned as he took a step back, expecting it to be an exciting sight. Jay approached the guard and tried to get his attention. But the guard didn't move, and his gaze remained clouded, as always, staring into the void. "Fine, you want to stay still? Now you'll see what real combat is like," Jay thought, as he was already planning how to teach this lesson. The tourists who were nearby began to notice the situation around them. They took out their phones, filming everything that was happening. However, most of them could not understand that this was not just a prank, but the beginning of a real clash of different worlds. Jay took a few steps forward and stopped, letting everyone around him see his expert pose. His movements were smooth and relaxed, like a champion who trains every day. He was sure that even the slightest movement of the guardsman would make him move quickly into battle. "Maybe I should start with a light punch," Jay thought, looking at the guard's face. He looked back at his team, getting approval from his comrades. Jay moved, ready to begin this phase of his demonstration. But it was only the beginning. Jay could feel the adrenaline filling his body. His movements became even more precise, each step deliberate, each moment calculated. He had the confidence that came with years of training and victories. He knew he was invincible in the ring. And now this stoic guard was just another opponent for him to defeat. The distance between him and the guard was closing. Jay cautiously approached while the people around him did not yet realize what was happening. They just stared, waiting for the changing of the guard, but Jay saw them as a helpless audience. Tourists were giggling, some were filming, suspecting it was part of some kind of show. Realizing this, Jay decided to demonstrate his skills. He took a short step toward the guard and quickly swung his arm, delivering a light punch in the air. However, all he got in return was a cold stare from the guard. No reaction. If this was a ring, Jay would have already won, but this was not the case. "Can't you hear me? I'm right here," Jay said mockingly, giggling and taking another step forward, determined to teach him another lesson. And that's when he made his first mistake. He underestimated the guard's reaction. The guard, whom he thought was just a static part of the scenery, tilted his head slightly for a moment, and his hand moved naturally, instantly throwing Jay off balance. This small change in the guardsman's behavior didn't stop Jay, but he felt his pride begin to crack. Is this some kind of trick? Why isn't he reacting like a normal person? He thought, but continued to believe that he was just not taking him seriously. He went on the offensive again, using what he thought was his strength to end the show. And so, when he came a few steps closer, unable to stand his own calm any longer, Jay made a quick kick, aiming his foot at the guardsman's head. The kick was accurate, powerful, and, in Jay's mind, would inevitably bring down the enemy. But what happened next? Jay could not have predicted. He hit the guardsman and suddenly realized that something had gone wrong. The guardsman's body did not flinch, as would have happened to any other man if he had been hit with such force. Instead, the guardsman's hat flew into the air, and he remained standing as if nothing had happened. The realization that his punch hadn't worked almost deafened Jay. It was more than just a surprise. It was a catastrophic underestimation of the situation. Not only did the guard not fall, he didn't even change his expression. His gaze remained steady and cold, focused on his mission. Jay froze, stopping his hand for a moment. His pride began to crumble. He couldn't understand what was happening. All his confidence, all his strategy began to melt away like snow under the scorching sun. The tourists standing around were no longer laughing. They saw that something serious had happened. No one dared to speak, but there was more than just curiosity in their eyes. And then something happened that Jay didn't expect. The guard turned his head, his gaze became sharp, and he was filled with incomparable determination. This moment changed everything. The guardsman did not move, but his eyes, which had previously seemed dead and lifeless, now showed a spark of awareness. Jay felt his pride begin to melt slowly, leaving only embarrassment behind. The punch that was supposed to show all his superiority not only failed to overcome the guard, but also left him indifferent, almost cold. What the hell? Jay thought, trying to figure out what was going on. He took a step back, ready for the next move, but something in the guard's behavior made him pause. The guardsman's body didn't move, but his eyes never left Jay. The feeling that the guard had been watching him all this time, knowing his movements and reading his thoughts, was overwhelming. Jay instantly realized that this was more than just standing still. This man was more than just a part of the circus. The guardsman, without changing his posture, tipped his hat, which was now lying on the ground. And then Jay noticed something that hadn't been obvious before. There was no fear in his eyes. Moreover, he felt that this man had no intention of showing him how he could defend himself. No. The guardsman was just waiting for the arena moment to disappear and the real fight to begin. This is not what I was expecting, Jay thought, gathering the last of his strength not to show his doubts. The guardsman stepped forward, but his movement was so precise and calm that Jay barely had time to react. He tried to retreat, but the man struck quickly and accurately, without making any excessive movement, but only effectively overcoming his defense. The punch was so powerful that Jay didn't even realize he was on the ground. All his confidence, which he had once perceived as invincible, was now crumbling. He didn't stand a chance. He could feel his strength leaving him, and the guardsman, without any unnecessary movements, held him firmly, his knees calmly lowering Jay to the ground like an unnecessary element. This was not a show. This was not just a demonstration of strength or technique. This was a fight. A real fight, and Jay realized that he was not in a ring, but in a world where discipline and real-world experience mattered. "Stay on the ground," the guard said coldly, showing no emotion. His voice was calm, almost unquestioning. Jay couldn't believe what was happening. Despair shone in his eyes. He hadn't expected this response, hadn't prepared himself to face this level of discipline. His hands began to drop motionlessly. He tried to understand how and why this person looked like he was completely independent of the situation. How and why his movements defied any training that Jay was sure he had. At the same time, a group of people gathered around him, who were no longer laughing. They stood in absolute silence, watching the champion and the soldier, two completely different people, but with the same determination, stand against each other. Each of them had their own world, but this moment brought them together in one precise moment where discipline and experience became more important than strength. And right now, at this moment, Jay could feel his pride gradually fading. The more he tried to resist, the more he realized that he simply had no place in this world. This fight was not just a victory for the guard, it was his reality. The tourists who had been laughing or filming everything now stood silently watching the scene unfold before them. Most of them probably didn't understand what was really happening, but they all felt one thing. What they were seeing was more than just a show of force. They were witnessing their idealized view of strength and discipline change when confronted with reality. Jay still lay on the ground, his chest heaving heavily from the effort, but he could not say a word. His pride, which had once been his strongest shield, was now torn to shreds. He raised his head, and his gaze settled on the guardsman standing in front of him, waiting. The soldier's face was emotionless, without any sign of fatigue or joy at what had happened. His gaze was calm, as if he had done nothing special. Jay was still trying to put his thoughts in order, although it was hard for him to accept what had happened. His hands were nervous, and the feeling of powerlessness that he could not overcome was depressing him. He tried to get up, but the guard, without changing his position, put his hand on his chest and held it lightly but firmly. "Stay where you are." His voice was calm, slightly, even cautiously friendly, but left no room for discussion. For a few more seconds, Jay tried to resist. He couldn't understand how this had happened. After all, he was a champion. He had gone through the most difficult training, won the most brutal battles. And yet now he was on the ground, and it was not a metaphor. He was destroyed not physically, but morally. And there was nothing majestic about what he was feeling. Everything around him became quieter. A few moments passed, and Jay finally felt his arms drop and stopped trying to stand up. He looked at the guard, then at the people around him, who continued to watch, staring at them. At that moment, an older man in military clothing approached him and immediately caught his attention. It was Colonel Thomas Wright, a former British Army officer who no longer served, but had not lost touch with the army. "Did you see what happened?" he asked calmly, standing next to him. His voice had no irony or judgment, but it was clear and firm. Jay was silent, not knowing what to say. It was a moment when words could not change anything. He could feel his shame and bitterness become as heavy as a stone on his chest. The colonel watched him for a few seconds and then, without waiting for an answer, continued. "Those who you thought were just static guards are actually people who have been through more than any of us can imagine. You didn't stand a chance, Jay. Not because you weren't strong or didn't train, but because you didn't realize that true strength is not the power of physical blows. It's the strength of mind, discipline, and standing your ground when everyone around you wants you to fall." Jay felt the colonel's words pierce him to the core. And although he could not immediately fully comprehend everything that was said, he knew deep down that it was true. He hurriedly glanced at the guardsman, who didn't even seem to change his position, as if he was continuing his mission despite everything that had happened. "You can get up when you're ready," the guard said, and his words were not in order. It was a simple fact. It was a reality that Jay could not escape. And although his physical body was not damaged, inside he could feel his pride barely holding on to the edge. But in that moment, as he lay on the ground and his enemy stood still, he suddenly realized that there are some people who cannot be defeated by force alone. All his victories in the ring and the awards he had won now seemed to him to be just part of a game that had no meaning here in reality, where true strength is endurance, discipline, and the willingness to stand to the end. Jay was ready to get up, but now he had to take one more step to recognize that the real fight was not yet over. And this battle was not with the guardsman. It was a fight with himself. Jay sat on the ground, slowly getting up, watching the guard return to his post without a single change in his face. He did not turn around, did not laugh, did not wait for recognition. He simply returned and stood in place, as he had done thousands of times before, as he had been trained to do. It was more than just a duty. It was in him. Beside him, Colonel Wright stood silently, his gaze remaining fixed on Jay. He made no attempt to explain, no demand for clarification. He just watched. Jay looked up, and his eyes met the guardsman's, but this time it was different. Not a challenge, not disdain. It was something more, a sense that everything that had happened had a place, even if he couldn't understand it right away. Jay felt his heart calm a little. He hadn't been defeated just because of the physical battle. He had been defeated because of his misunderstanding. And now, sitting on the cold ground, he felt the importance of this moment more than any medal or trophy he had ever won in his career. "It's not that easy, is it?" said Colonel Wright quietly, breaking the silence again. His voice was calm but had the depth of experience. Jay took a deep breath but did not answer. "Real combat is not what you see in the gym, not what you win in the ring. It's a war with yourself. It is understanding when you need to give in and when you need to hold the line. And it is discipline. This is not a strength that can be measured in punches. It's a strength that we build through every moment, every day," the colonel added, as if giving a final lesson, a lesson that Jay needed to realize. Jay couldn't answer right away. He just stood there in silence, feeling his pride gradually recede. What had seemed so important, so majestic, suddenly became just a part of his past. He realized that the fight with this guardsman, even with everything that was happening, was not about winning. It was about realizing where he stood in a world where there were others who had more than just power. The sky above the palace began to lighten, and Jay looked at the guard, who was once again standing still, as if time had no meaning to him. Time dragged on slowly, and with each passing second he realized that the victory in the ring was only an illusion. The reality was much more complicated. All these years he had trained to be the best in his world, but now he realized that in the world outside of his world, being the best did not mean being the strongest. The real strength was elsewhere, in steadfastness, in the willingness to stand even when everyone expects you to move. The strength to stand still when everything around you is moving. Jay turned to the colonel, who was watching him with understanding but no pity. There was no disdain or condemnation in his expression, just a tacit acceptance that everyone has to go their own way, and that this was only the beginning for Jay. "It's not what I expected," he finally said, not addressing the colonel, but simply saying it out loud, as if to himself. He didn't know why he said it, but it was true. The colonel nodded, adding quietly, "Sometimes the greatest lessons come not through victory, but through defeat." Jay looked at the guardsman with a new understanding. He no longer saw him as an object to be fought or as someone to be broken. Now he saw him as a man who had his own way, his own principles, his own story, which he did not reveal in public, but which was fiercely strong. Step by step, Jay made a choice. He was leaving this fight behind. He stood up, feeling his body regain its balance. Now he was no longer a champion who won in the ring. Now he was just a man who was learning to be stronger by being able to stand still.